Hello and welcome back to the Grey Script and Everything in Between podcast. Today I want to talk about something many of us experience but very few people openly discuss. Why do we sometimes stay in situations that hurt us? Why do we remain in relationships that drain us, continue habits we know aren't good for us, or repeat patterns we promised ourselves we would never go back to? You see, from the outside, people might look and say, why don't you just leave? Why don't you just change? Why don't you do something different? But the truth is, the mind simply doesn't always work like that. And today we're going to explore why. So the mind loves familiarity. One of the most powerful things to understand about the human mind is this: your brain is not primarily designed to make you happy. It's designed to keep you safe. And safety to the brain often means familiarity, even if what is familiar is unhealthy. Even if what is familiar causes pain. If something feels known, predictable, and familiar, the brain often interprets that as safer than the unknown. Which means sometimes people remain in situations that are emotionally difficult simply because the alternative feels uncertain. And this can apply to relationships, work environments, friendships, habits, patterns of thinking. Familiar does not always mean healthy. But to the brain, familiar feels manageable. Childhood conditioning. Why many of our emotional patterns begin forming during childhood. So before the age of 5, the brain is highly impressionable. During those early years, we learn beliefs such as what love looks like, what respect looks like, what conflict looks like, and what attention looks like. If a child grows up in an environment where love and pain are mixed together, the mind can begin to associate those two things. So later in life, relationships that include emotional ups and downs may feel strangely familiar. Not because the person wants pain, but because the pattern feels known. And when something feels known, the brain relaxes. This is why awareness is so important. Because once you recognize the pattern, you begin to create space to change it. Self-sabotage. Another reason people stay stuck is self-sabotage. Self-sabotage often appears when someone begins moving towards growth. So imagine someone starting to build confidence or improving their life. Sometimes an inner voice appears saying, "Who do you think you are? You'll fail anyway. You don't deserve this." That voice usually isn't the truth. It's often an old protective mechanism created during earlier experiences in life. The mind learned that staying small or quiet once protected you. So when you try to expand, the brain tries to pull you back to the old comfort zone. Not because it wants to hurt you, but because it believes it's protecting you. Now I want to pause for a moment and ask you something. Is there a situation in your life right now that feels familiar but is not healthy? Maybe it's a relationship, maybe it's a habit, maybe it's a belief about yourself. Just notice it. You don't need to judge yourself. Awareness is the first step of change. So the turning point. The moment life begins to change is when awareness meets courage. When you start asking questions like, why do I accept this? Why do I stay here? What would a healthier version of this situation look like? And perhaps the most important question of all, what do I truly deserve? Because sometimes the real work is not just changing our environment, it's changing the belief we hold about our own worth. When someone begins to genuinely believe they deserve peace, respect, and stability, their standards begin to shift. And when standards shift, choices begin to change. So how are we going to break this pattern? Breaking patterns rarely happen overnight. It happens in small moments, small decisions, small acts of courage. Sometimes it begins with setting one boundary. Sometimes it begins with changing one habit. Sometimes it begins with choosing not to respond in the same way that you always have. Every small step creates new direction. And over time, those small steps reshape your life. So if you recognize yourself in today's conversation, please remember this: you are not broken. Your mind simply learned patterns that once helped you survive. But survival and thriving are not the same thing. And the beautiful thing about the human mind is that it can grow. It can learn and it can change. Awareness is where transformation begins. And if today's episode helped you reflect on something in your life, then that is already a powerful step forward. Thank you for spending time with me again this week. It has been grace, grit, and everything in between. And I will see you next week.